I'm delighted to be able to welcome Larry back. Because, Larry, I wanted to talk about these leaked documents. I lean to the point of view that these documents are genuine. I know that some, that may include you, lean away from that. But the more I read of them, the more they have the ring of truth to me. What's your take on that? And if they are or are not real, where did they come from?
George, I fully agree with you. They're 100% genuine, authentic. And it could only have come through really a small number of people, because most folks don't understand the classification level. So if you see something that's secret, well, that secret can be shared with people from foreign countries. But there were also documents that were labeled secret no foreign. Well, those can't be shared with foreigners. And in this case, the United Kingdom, personnel from the United Kingdom, including Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak, they're foreigners, so you can't share it with them. There's also top secret material. Now, there are occasions in which top secret material is shared, but this document that has been released came out of the CIA Operations Center. I worked in that operations center in the summer of 1986 for 2 months. So that kind of document is familiar to me. I think this was leaked by someone who was so disgusted by the lying that is going on within the Biden administration, particularly out of the Department of Defense, out of the Director of the National Intelligence Agency, and out of the CIA itself, because the war in Ukraine, as described in those documents, is quite distinct from the great victory that's being described regularly in briefings by people like the Secretary of Defense, Austin.
I think that is the greatest chasm. The reality of the war as it emerges from these documents, compared to the surreality of the briefings and indeed the subsequent mass media reportage of the conflict, is so vast that it must be utterly demoralizing to the war party that this is now in front not just of foreigners, Larry, but to every Tom, Dick and Harry in the world with internet connection.
Yes, I have a friend who's an intelligence officer with one of the military commands. And he told me when these first came out, he was surprised that this had not happened before, because he said there's a lot of disgruntlement and unrest and unhappiness among the rank and file. They're wondering amongst themselves, what the hell are we trying to do? Because they recognize, for example, all this public talk about counteroffensive by Ukraine, yet what is clearly revealed in those documents is, one, the air defense system of Ukraine is being degraded in such a way that it will be non-existent by the middle of May. Number two, that the United States and NATO are not able to supply Ukraine with enough shells to be able to respond to the overwhelming barrage that they're receiving from Russia. And even with commitments to ramp up production. Well, how do you carry out a counteroffensive if you don't have artillery, you don't have armor, you don't have air cover, and you don't have air defense? It's suicidal. It's madness. And I think that one person or more than one person took the route of an Edward Snowden. They decided to blow the whistle. They got the documents out of this. These documents would have been held in something called a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. So people can't just walk in there with a camera and take pictures. Whoever did this took the documents out, folded them, got them to a safe location, then photographed them. The reason for the photograph is to try to obscure the digital signatures. There are markings on the documents, if they are not treated in a different way, that can help tell you exactly what printer they came off of. So this is one of the things that investigators will be looking for right now.
The investigation, of course, is one that might never come to a conclusion if the intention is to throw sand in our eyes by implying that these documents are not genuine, or in part not genuine, or have been altered or falsified in some way. It's difficult to see which way for the American state, the deep state, to turn on this, because it's only a month or 2 or 3 before we can see that they were lying, that there was no counteroffensive, and if there was, that it was a flop. I mean, they're trying to buy time, but buy time for what, Larry?
Well, at the same time, they've got the pretense, this false story, that it is a unified NATO, that we're all pulling in the same direction to oppose Russia. And that's just not the case. As you've seen, the United States is busy trying to impose sanctions on Hungary. France has come out and spoken very clearly about the need to not be saddled, chained together with the United States, particularly when it comes to issues like Taiwan. So the entire premise of U.S. foreign policy is literally unraveling over the last 2 months in the wake of the Putin-Xi Jinping summit in Moscow. We now see Saudi Arabia taking a completely independent course. We see the Chinese with the Saudis negotiating an end to the war in Yemen. That's underway. We see Saudi Arabia and Iran reaching peace. Because in the past, the United States used the Saudis as a wedge to try to provoke conflict in the region. You see Russia working with Turkey to bring rapprochement between Turkey and Syria. All of a sudden, several cornerstones of U.S. foreign policy are just falling apart. So this goes much beyond just the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is, in fact, somewhat of a symptom of the loss of U.S. power and influence in the world, and thank God, because what the United States has been doing over the last 25 years, it's a vicious bully, and it's been killing people and leaving trails of blood instead of bringing about a more peaceful world.
And yet, as the saying goes, when you're in a hole, stop digging. But they are breaking that law.
Yeah.
I could have set my stopwatch, but Singapore just upgraded its relations with China, and lo and behold, in the New York Times today, there's a smear on Singapore of the type that we've seen before. Well, Singapore's a big success story, but at what cost? Look at the lack of this, that, and the next thing in Singapore. Ditto Macron. Macron is getting the full Mark Rubio treatment. He is being accused of betrayal because he made the blindingly obvious observation that to be someone's ally is not the same thing as being their vassal. So they don't seem to be reading the room in Washington.
Yeah. Well, you and I are about the same age. You recall how Charles de Gaulle used to constantly tweak the Washington president, whoever it was at the time, that de Gaulle was not going to be on his knees bowing and scraping before the West. He was going to do what he wanted, what he felt was best in France's interest. Now, I think Macron is a terrible leader, but he's smart enough to recognize that tying himself to the United States at this point is a losing cause. By contrast, I don't know if you saw any of the images of Rishi Sunak with Joe Biden today. My Lord, I have never seen a sycophant sucking up in such a. I mean, he was like a schoolgirl with one of the Beatles back in the day. I mean, he was just giddy with joy. No gravitas about that. And, Joe Biden probably didn't even know where he was.
And he certainly ain't no John Lennon, not even a Ringo Starr.
Yeah.
But the reality is that this west of which we speak is an Anglo-Saxon bubble, isn't it? And that's increasingly obvious. There was some polling done by, I think, Gallup in Germany this week, which showed that up to 40% of the German public opinion had a positive or slightly positive attitude towards the Russian action in Ukraine. Almost 40%, in fact, exactly 40%, thought that the Russians had a point in what they were saying about the Ukraine story. No wonder James Rubin or Mr. Christian Amanpour is on a tour of Central Europe at the moment, trying to root out any such dissident views. But it's too late, Larry. The cat is out of the bag. The identification of the US with a losing cause is now almost universal.
Well, the United States has gotten away just in the last 23 years, an invasion of Afghanistan, an invasion of Iraq, an invasion of Syria, military operations in Libya, attempted coup, a successful coup in the Maidan in Ukraine, attempted coups in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Georgia. And so the United States is out of control. We have, up to this point, been able to throw our weight around, overthrow governments at will, and gotten away with it. And nobody's pushed back. But now Russia's pushing back. Russia's saying no more. And the Chinese watched this, I think, very carefully and realized that if they did not stand with Russia in pushing back against the West, they would be the next ones on the chopping block. Because the language here in the United States is that China is our enemy, that Taiwan is not a part of China. Everything that U.S. policy has been predicated on since Richard Nixon went to China in 1972 is now disappeared, vanished. It's as if we're living in an alternate universe.
And if you make that 23 years, 25 years, we'll throw in Yugoslavia, which I said in Parliament at the time. If they get away with this in Yugoslavia, a whole series of similar attacks, invasions, occupations will follow. And that was obvious to me then, and not, alas, to the majority of my compatriots, still less the citizens of Europe. But this idea is spreading like wildfire now, that European prosperity, manufacturing capacity, energy security, currency stability are all now gravely undermined by shackling ourselves to a president as unimpressive, indeed downright creepy and scary as Joe Biden. It's very hard to understand what kind of political leadership that was. I think Macron is a change in the wind, don't you?
Yes. I mean, it's pointing out the weakness of Joe Biden. I mean, the policies that the United States are pursuing are not the policies of Joe Biden. It is, as we like to talk about, the deep state. But when you think about it, just take as one example, the United States sees Iran as a threat. So how did the United States come up with a policy to deal with Iran? We got with the Saudis, got behind the Saudis and starting a war in Yemen, going against the Houthi rebels who had some relationship with Iran, but we saw that as a way to try to weaken Iran. And in the process, killing tens of thousands of Yemenis, men, women, children, with nobody in the United States was losing a night of sleep over it. This is fundamental evil. It is fundamental evil what the United States has become. We push out this line that we have to fear China and Russia because they are aggressive imperial powers. Yet the fact is, the last country that China invaded was Vietnam, and that was in response to a Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, and that was over 40 years ago. Uh, Russia has gone into Georgia in response to being attacked, and in response to what the NATO governments were doing with Ukraine over the last 8 years, threatening Russia. Other than that, the only time Russia's gone overseas militarily was at the invitation of the government of Syria. The only country in the world, or actually two, the only countries in the world that have been aggressive in carrying out military operations in other nations without the permission of those nations are the United States and the United Kingdom. The blood is on the hands of the Anglo-Saxons, if you will.
Yes, alas, as you and I think are both, although I'm from the Celtic fringe. Just lastly, Larry, and I'm always grateful for your time and wisdom, really seriously. These threats against China, they can't really be real, are they? Is it rhetoric? Is it bluff? Is it a poker game? Do they think the Chinese will back down? Because I'll tell you what, if I was in charge of China, Larry, Taiwan would already be in my hands by now. Because if they are going to Ukrainianize Taiwan, well, you might as well take it now than have to fight all the harder to take it once the United States has fortified it. Are they really going to turn Taiwan into the new Ukraine?
Yes, they're going to try. I agree with you. It's craziness. It's an insanity. The United States does not have the military power to fight China and win, short of using nuclear weapons. And even then, that ends up being a suicide pact. So yet the rhetoric among the political leaders, Republican and Democrat alike in the United States, the message reflected in the media, the message reflected in many of the major corporations is increasingly describing China as an enemy, as the ultimate threat. We need to get, Russia is seen as a minor irritant, that the real enemy, people say this, the real enemy is China. Now, China has heard that. That's one of the reasons why the United States has been desperately trying to make a phone call to Xi Jinping. He refuses to pick up the phone. He won't talk to us anymore. I don't blame him. I wouldn't talk to us. So this is, I think, unfortunately, you and I and your viewers and listeners are living in one of the most dangerous times in the last 150 years. It is fraught with peril, and the United States, I fear, is going to do something incredibly stupid. The only silver lining in that is it will be like an alcoholic waking up after a near-death experience. It may compel a change in what up to this point have been dead-end imperialist policies.
Unless Trump comes back, Larry, he says he can sort it all out with a few phone calls.
Yeah, unfortunately, Trump too is he's less inclined for military adventurism. That is true. But he still labors under this illusion that the Americas got the greatest military power in the world. But we got the most expensive military power. We're like a Lamborghini with no tires. So, we're very costly, but you can't drive us anywhere.
How brilliantly put, a Lamborghini with no tires. That's a phrase, a zinger that will live. Larry Johnson, as always, you never disappoint. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.